Listen to what he had to say again. Cut number 21.
Well, what are we not doing as well as a country to deal with our economy?
Good question. The economy now is actually looking quite resilient. If you look at what's happening in energy, enormous boom. In agriculture, even with the drought, you're seeing incredible levels of income to farmers, which is really welcome. In manufacturing, one of the strongest periods in manufacturing revival that we've seen in almost a generation, not just in autos and not just in high tech, but comprehensively across that. We're showing American companies very competitive, very resilient, and companies are bringing back production from China and Mexico because this is looking like a much stronger country in which to invest and build.
All right, so looking very resilient. Well, apparently not resilient enough because we can't afford any cuts in government spending. But I also disagree with some of the facts that were presented there. I do not believe that we are having this revival of our manufacturing. I can't see it in the output. I can't see it in the employment statistics. I do agree that there is a boom in energy. That has nothing to do with the president's policies. It's happening despite the president's policies. Agriculture is doing well. Yes, farmers are making a lot of money. Yes, they are, because the rest of us are paying a ton of money to eat. Farm prices are very high. The drought isn't hurting the farmers because of the government provided crop insurance. Many of the farmers made more money not harvesting their crops because of the lucrative deal that the government gave them. So yes, because of Fed policy, cheap money, and government policy of subsidized agricultural insurance, yeah, the farmers are doing really well. But the people who have to buy their food, not doing so well. Listen here again. More of Timothy Geithner claiming everything is great, and the only thing we have to fear is that the government might spend less money. Here, cut number 22.
The people running America's businesses would say they're in the strongest position they've been in maybe a decade in terms of the ability they have to expand and grow. And if we are able to lift this threat of big tax increases on middle-class Americans, lift this threat of periodic threats of default, lift this threat of badly designed, deeply severe austerity on the spending side up front, then I think there's enormous potential for the American economy to grow faster going forward. And that's what the president heard from the leaders of America's businesses.
And if you don't...
Yeah, those of you who are premium members, you can see me laughing as the Secretary of Treasury is speaking. It's hard to contain that laughter when he says stuff that is so obviously and patently absurd, that we have to remove the threat of massive austerity. What is this massive austerity? What cuts? The cuts that we end up with if we go over this cliff are tiny. They're minuscule. They're spits in the ocean. They're mountains. They're molehills on mountains. There is not one businessman who's saying, gee, what I'm afraid of the most is that the government reduces spending. They're not. That's not what they're worried about. And again, here's what he said. He said businesses think that they're in the best shape in 10 years. Who? Who are these supposed entrepreneurs, businessmen, that say they're the best position they were in the last 10 years? Find me this guy. I'd like to speak with him. How can that be? Businesses are about to be hit with massive increases in taxes and regulation as a result of the implication of Obamacare, Dodd-Frank. How can anybody think that this is the best environment to be a businessman in 10 years? It's probably the worst time to be a businessman. I don't know how we can, get away with saying this kind of stuff. And again, saying that we're worried about the U.S. government defaulting, that the way we can eliminate that risk is by getting rid of the debt ceiling. That doesn't eliminate the risk. That intensifies the risk. That means that anybody who was worried about the debt, who thought that the debt ceiling might in some way restrain our ability to take on more debt, well, now they know that there's no restraint at all. We've removed that last impediment to debt, and so there is no ceiling. The sky is the limit. How is that going to make Americans feel better, knowing that the sky is now the limit when it comes to deficit spending? This is all a bunch of self-serving nonsense, that all we have to do, that the only thing holding back the economy is the fear of draconian spending cuts. And as long as we preserve the enormous deficits and just raise taxes on the rich, which of course is probably the business owners themselves, everything's going to be great. So supposedly these entrepreneurs, these businessmen, they're going to say, hey, just raise my taxes and keep everything else the same, and everything is going to be great. Because I'm not worried about Obamacare. I'm not worried about Dodd-Frank. I'm not worried about the deficits. I'm not worried about anything. In fact, I'm happy to pay higher taxes. Just raise my taxes up, and everything is going to be great because the whole economy is going to come roaring back because the deficits are still here. That because the government is still spending money and because 98% of Americans aren't going to have to pay higher taxes, well, everything is just going to be great. I want to meet these fools that are supposedly running businesses in the United States. I don't think anybody smart enough to run a business is dumb enough to fall for that. But anyway, I could be wrong. There could be a few of them out there. 855-4-SCHIFF is the number to call. In fact, if you are one of these businessmen that is in favor of what the president is proposing, if you really think that everything is the greatest it's been in 10 years, and the only thing standing in your way between hiring lots of people is this idea that the government might reduce spending next year, hey, I want to hear from you. Again, 855-4-SCHIFF. We've been listening to Tim Geithner on NBC's Meet the Press. Well, Grover Norquist also came on. Now, Grover Norquist is basically, he's been the real, boogeyman of this whole thing. He's been vilified on pretty much every news show out there. And he came on himself on Meet the Press, and Jim Cramer of CNBC was also on there. And the two went back and forth about the fiscal cliff. And, of course, Jim Cramer thinks that the cliff is a disaster and we just need not to go over it. And that Grover Norquist is threatening the economy, threatening the markets. Here's a little bit of that discussion, cut number 26.
What this is about is avoiding a recession, which is going to happen. I know you don't want a recession. You don't want people laid off. You're going to sacrifice that on the cost of 2%? Is that what you want?
No. You got to listen to both what the Republicans are talking about. And again, I'm supportive of the Republican position, which is we need to have economic growth, not higher taxes. If we grew at 4% a year instead of 2% a year, Reagan levels instead of Obama levels, for 1 decade, we'd net $5 trillion in additional revenue. That would pay down the debt that Obama's run up with the cylindrous stimulus stuff.
Well, first of all, it's not quite as simple as Grover maintains, but if you listen to Jim Cramer, he says that all we have to do to avoid a recession is raise taxes on the rich. That's not going to avoid anything. And, of course, a recession, unfortunately, is part of the bitter-tasting medicine that we need to swallow. Yes, nobody wants a recession, but sometimes a recession is necessary. And, unfortunately, this is one of those times. It is necessary. Now, if you don't want a recession, well, then don't inflate an artificial bubble. Don't artificially stimulate the economy so that the resources get so screwed up, so that the malinvestments are so big that correcting them means you're going to have a recession. The fact that I am advocating policies that will bring on a recession sooner rather than later, it's not because I want people to suffer. I don't. And I know that if we spare them that suffering today, it's only because we condemn them to even greater suffering tomorrow. But that's something that Jim Cramer doesn't understand. And, of course, our politicians, even if they understand it, they don't want to admit it, because then they might be the ones that have to suffer at the polls when they don't get returned to their extravagant Washington lifestyles. The president is not the only one who's treated like royalty. I bet all these senators and representatives fancy themselves some kind of members of a royal court there in Washington, D.C., as they live high on everybody else's hog. Here's a little bit more of the discussion with Cramer and Grover Norquist, cut 27.
Clinton did so much better in the stock market with these rates.
Well, that was a different time. We were at the edge of the new innovation, the internet boom.
No Obamacare, no threat of regulations. Now, understand how ugly the next 4 years are going to get. Everything in Obamacare that Obama didn't want you to focus on or think about, the 90% of his $1 trillion tax increase was pushed over till after he got himself safely reelected. All those regulations you're now hearing about, okay, that are being grumbled about, those all hit after the election. We got 4 bad years of regulation, taxes. He wants to add higher taxes to Tea Party 2 is going to dwarf Tea Party 1 if Obama pushes us off the cliff.
Maria,
let's not pretend who's pushing us
right.
over
Well,
the
we'll
cliff.
see who actually pushes anybody off the cliff.
Yeah, well, meanwhile, Grover is right about that. But Jim Cramer, again, trying to say how great the stock market was in the 90s under the Bill Clinton tax rates. Well, first of all, the tax rates, if we do what the president wants to do, will actually be higher thanks to his new Obamacare, Medicare taxes. But the reason we had a big stock market gain in the 90s wasn't because of those high tax rates. It was despite those high tax rates. It was because of a bubble that we had in the NASDAQ. We're not going to go back to a stock market bubble anytime soon. Maybe Jim Cramer would like to have a bubble. Of course, nobody at CNBC even recognized that there was a bubble until well after it burst, including Jim Cramer. He didn't recognize the housing bubble either. He never recognizes bubbles, even when they burst and the suds are all over his face. So he's longing for the good old days of the 1990s, and somehow he thinks that it was all a function of higher taxes, as if we just raised taxes on the rich and we're going to have a more vibrant stock market. Unfortunately, Jim Cramer doesn't really understand the stock market. He thinks he does, but apparently he doesn't really. Anyway, but the spin that we're getting from Washington and from guys like Jim Cramer is that we hurt the economy by shrinking government. That the way we grow the economy is to make sure the government is bigger and bigger and bigger and takes more and more resources away from the private sector. Somehow this is supposed to enrich us. That's what impoverishes us. Ask the Soviet Union. How that worked out. Ask the Cubans how that worked out. Anyway, that's all for today. You've been listening to the Peter Schiff Show here at SchiffRadio.com, the gold standard in talk radio.